Good evening, everyone. I want to thank the Faro Foundation and especially its president, Javier Milei, for organizing such an event to discuss and spread the ideas of freedom. Ideas are not inert or transcendent issues. Ideas move. What happened? Ideas move. Hello, Professor. How are you? Hello, Professor. Ideas move the world. It was the autopsy. Now I understand what a team I have. Ideas move the world. They order our wishes and our expectations and allow us to give meaning to a more complex and chaotic world every day. As Hobbes has said, the acts of men come from their opinions. I would also like to thank the national and former academic director of this institution, Adrian Rapier. Thank you. Not only have I been accompanied by different events of economic dissemination in recent times, and with whom we have published the book, The Battle for Macroeconomics, a few weeks ago. Thank you, Adrian. In addition, as part of the most reformist Congress in history, it has made a huge contribution to the reformation of laws that are making possible Argentina in the future. And above all, I want to congratulate him and thank him, because in the coming days, a huge challenge will begin to become the president's spokesperson. Thank you, Adrian. This is a fundamental work for what we call the cultural battle. Given that our management is carrying out transcendental changes for the present and future lives of Argentinians, and this generates movements of all kinds. One of the most notorious movements is the ever deeper divergence that exists between what really happens and what is reported to the public by unspoken means of intellectual honesty. Within the amount of atrocities that we have heard, suffered and suffered in recent times, one of the things that journalists and supposedly serious analysts were talking about is that the economy was sunk in a depression, that consumption was destroyed. They were talking about inflation. They're interesting because today all those lies fell. Today the GDP data was published for the first quarter. The first quarter showed a growth compared to the same quarter of the previous year of 2.3%, a situation that makes us break a new historical record in production. At the same time, that data, if we take it in the distinction comparison, compared to the previous quarter, the economy expanded to a 0.7% rate in the quarter, which in annualized terms would be a rate of around 3%. It seems like a lowly, humble number. But the reality is that when one looks at the history of Argentina, the 100 years prior to us in power, the average annual growth rate was 0.9%. That is less than 1%. That is to say that our waste quarter is 3 times bigger than what happened over the last 100 years of the populist socialist catastrophe. But this is not all, because when the economy hit the bottom. Back in April 2024, the economy started to grow very strongly. Data that the media began to hide systematically while the economy was beginning to grow, where the relevant data was to see them stationed, to see how the economy evolved. They were in charge of showing only the interannual comparisons in such a way as to continue showing negative data, when in reality, the me train that brought the economy to the bottom, the me chain that brought the statistical drag of what the previous government had left was a 3% drop. Naturally, when the interannuals began to do well, they began to show them the station because the numbers are clearly smaller. That is, there was a stagnation in always showing the data in the worst way, and that in a supposed media that are supposed to be aligned with the idea of freedom, that in reality are not allied with anything. They are only allied with stealing from politics through guidelines and through extortion in the judicial system. But what is the interesting thing about this? The Khazri always recognized that the economy had a strong deceleration, and that is explained by what was the attack of politics during the second half of last year, with a Congress that sanctioned us, issued 40 laws to break the fiscal balance, to break the heart of the program, fights in laws where they approved expenses without counterfeiting of income. That is a real orgy that sought to destroy the Argentinians. Not only that, the counterpart of that was that the country's risk, that is, the QT risk, was at the level of 1,500 basic points. That added to the fall of the demand for money, the inflationary acceleration shot the interest rates to the stratosphere, the rates in pesos, and consequently, that generated a strong break in the Argentine economy. The Argentine economy that had been growing at rate in the first quarter of the sixth, accelerating to the eighth, suddenly, in the face of this savagery, where, in addition, they tried 7 political trials, where they tried to do all kinds of paraphernalia between the media, politics, and businessmen, destroying the market of exchanges, oil, putting people in the street to generate terror, literally. Despite that, we managed to overcome that attack of politics that tried to take the position of the government. And in the October elections, we faced 41 to 24. We got 17 points. From that, the rest of the country fell strongly. Today, we are at the lowest level of the last 8 or 9 years with the country risk, around 420 points. And this, which I'm pointing out, is, from my point of view, important because when you look at the data of the GDP, you have a strong 12 in exports. which is the craziest change-making delay in the world because exports, since we started, grow 5 times stronger than what the GDP grows. I mean, truly, it's the craziest change-making delay in the world, while the central bank has bought, for example, from the beginning of the year, $11 billion when we had a goal for the whole year of 10,000. A strange change-making delay. Funds. The interesting thing is that in this context, in addition to increasing consumption, why should it hurt all those who said that consumption was depressed? Obviously, they can't internalize that the mode of consumption has changed. But well, while they keep repeating their own lies or going to keep repeating the same chase. So, what one sees is where the problem was. Well, there was a strong drop of 11.6% in the investment, which is perfectly understandable as the country's risk accelerated to levels of 1,500 basis points. The interest rate, both in dollars and in pesos, it was very low. If in pesos, it went to the clouds. It's obvious that the component that suffers the most is investment. So one of the things that today we were working with Toto and his team is to counteract what would have happened without this attack of such a gross policy during last year, in the middle of last year. So the first exercise is welcome, Glesa. 16,000 deregulations. Applause for Colosso. I just told you the account of ESASPO, but it's interesting. You don't know how fun the chat is. But well, the interesting thing is that Toyo and his team, what we did is to counteract what would have happened if we hadn't had this risk-based country. So the first exercise, that one is trying today, well, at least the investment wouldn't have fallen. I mean, it would have been flat. Well, if one leaves the investment flat, what the devastation of the culture throws and they annualize it, the economy is no longer growing to 3, it's growing to 5. It's interesting, and the most interesting of all is what would have happened with the investment if we hadn't really had this attack, and we could have continued on the way as we're revolving. Prior to this madness, that was a second semester of last year, with which we assimilate with the behavior of the investment that we showed from the second quarter of 24 to the second quarter of 25. Well, if it hadn't been for this savagery that politics carried on last year, the economy would be growing at 7%, while we are generating the foundations of an economic miracle. Thank you. And I'm going to bring you even better news, because evidently the investment given this conscious risk, which we are going to continue working to lower, let alone when you compare the country's risk, which is what is left of this first mandate, if the Argentinians decide so, is around the 62 basic points. That is to say that everything, the risk comes down after the elections. Therefore, if the Argentinians decide to continue embracing freedom, the country's risk is going to implode. Argentina is going to be investment grade as it never saw before in its history. At the same time, let's not forget that we already have $150 billion in REI, and that they're going to start accelerating, a reason why the economy is going to accelerate. Not only that, there's the deregulation of the railways, with which we are also going to have pushing the economy from that side. And as if that were not enough, is also going to raise consumption. Because basically what we start to see is that we break that trend of falling real salaries, and the real salary has already started to grow. What is the data of the month of April won the salary to inflation, and also in the measure data, inflation rate continues to drop. What is going to happen is that the rentals are going to rise. Therefore, the consumption is also going to take off. Therefore, fasten your belts, because Argentina is starting to get great again. And I do not even tell you the inflator that implies the enormous work that a minister Sturzenegger is doing, deregulating, that implies releasing growing returns, with which that also accelerates growth. If we also follow this process of opening the economy, if we follow this process of opening that we are pointing out, that Argentina triples its opening coefficient, obviously in a long term, this is not going to be instant. That is clear. That is also going to generate more growth. It is the idea of division of work. It is limited by the size of the market. If you open the economy and enlarge the size of the market, the economy is going to grow even more, and also the enormous work that we are doing from the Ministry of Human Capital led by Sandra Petovilo. Therefore, we have let all the engines of growth in a context that will also raise the demand, and given that the monetary base is fixed inexorably, we are going to annihilate inflation. That is why, in this context, it is going to require expertise to explain, and above all, a lot of patience. Adrian's experience as an economist is a fundamental to also let the changes that are taking place in our management transcend the plan of the debate between economists and can reach all Argentinians. We want all Argentinians to be able to understand the historical moment that we live in and manage to take full advantage of it. And we trust you, Adrian, to be able to spread it in the right way. I would also like to thank Martin Krause. How are you doing, Professor? What a great book. Besides, I liked the chapter that touched me. It was all a matter of taste. Martin is the current academic director and fundamental piece of the foundation that helps us to carry out events of this magnitude, as well as to continue giving the cultural bustle in all corners of the country, to continue training young people and adults from all over the territory in the ideas of freedom. Thanks to his suggestion, today we had the opportunity to share the stage and highlight the work of two colossi of thought, the prosa of Alberto Venegas Lynch, son, Maximo Prosa of Argentine liberalism, and David Friedman, a theoretical sign of anarcho-liberalism. And as if he were the son of Milton Friedman. Thank you. What a beautiful talk we had today. I don't have the courage to ignore my great friend and professor. Abrita, he knows all the affection I have for him and the many times I taught with his work. Today I would like to honor especially David Friedman, who came from afar. I don't exaggerate when I say that having him in Buenos Aires is an event of historical proportions for the liberal tradition in Argentina. That is why I will take advantage of his speech to dialogue with his ideas, a thing we did today in the afternoon. David is the son of one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize winner and one of my personal references in life, to the point that one of my four-legged children was named Milton. But David did not sleep in the laurels of his lineage. Far from this, he honored the challenge of his inheritance and dedicated his life to political and economic theory. His work revolved around the central idea: it is necessary to expand the ideas of man's freedom in the main. Enemies in that mission are the states and their apostolic Europeans, the caste. Because there, where that individual finds a limit to his freedom, the state sees an extension of his power. Where the individual finds a regulation that prevents his business, the employee creates a way to make a profit. Thus, David proposed to take a little further to the frontier of his father's thought and dedicated the machinery of freedom, his most recognized work, to the exercise of how justice, defense, police could work, or even how something as complex as the contamination of a 100% private system could be solved. With us, he pointed to an eternal discussion that anarcho-liberalism has been giving since its different currents. And like other anarcho-liberal authors, David did not base his promises on the appeal to morality, nor was he inspired by the idea of the Lucian natural law, but rather purely and exclusively from the results that the solution we bring. In other words, if a society without a state generates more prosperity, freedom, and resolution of conflicts for the majority, that is more than enough to justify it. And for that, it would not need to invoke absolute natural rights. This approach was very fruitful in the cultural battle, given that it allowed to fight against the arguments of court. Well, I have to change the word because, in fact, the professor made a correct mention today about not using the term utilitarian, but arguments that gave place to the state intervention. We, in part, and then to the support. We take inspiration from this delegation at the time of formulating our public policies, characterized by a logic, mainly unregulated. I am going to make a point, because we do have a central axis on the question of values, and I want to point out the difference. First, there is no conflict between justice and efficiency. We adhere to the hypothesis of Huerta de Soto, who basically holds that one cannot sacrifice justice. Here, the altar of efficiency that tears something up is efficient cannot be, and there, and if it is efficient, it is naturally fair. I am going to do it as an example. In areas of efficiency, everything is not worth it, or in terms of achieving the result. That's booster. It is a strong assumption, because I am not in athletic conditions to be part of the example. But let's suppose that I was an excellent runner, or let's make the case of an excellent runner of 100 meters, flat type is, aside of series, but aside of ball. Well, that what is worth is only the result, and efficiency in achieving the result. It goes and hits the head with a shot, and from there it begins to win. Yes, it is going to achieve the result, but that would not be valid. It would be a disloyal way of achieving the result. That is, to achieve the result. Everything is not worth it. So, difference, which later I will explore in a few words. We maintain, very in line with David's work, that everything, or at least almost everything, that the state does, the market can do, that we have no difference. In fact, there is an anecdote that Federico tells, which is fabulous, because Federico was part of other government, and then one of the things that they asked him was a difference, for example, regarding the government of Mauricio Macri. So he tells that one of the things that they asked was how to do for the state to work well. Well, in this government, the question is different. Does a state really have to do this? The interesting thing is that over time, one discovers that now the well, that is, it goes against the interventionist logic that began to take force at the beginning of the 20th century, according to which the exact opposite happens. Statistics repeat over and over again that the market is inherently deficient, capricious, and that central planning leads to supposed rational administration of resources. Or currently, something has been reported in the face of the disaster that they have caused everywhere that they got involved in planning. Because, as Hayek said, the more the state plans, the less the private sector plans, and a disaster is generated, at least now. Amid that, the capitalist system generates better results, but from a supposedly altruistic position, they question that it is fair. That is, what they say is that the system is more productive, but that system is unfair. That too, I would like to make a reference to Israel Kushner in the back. Creativity, Capitalism, and Distributive Justice. And this is interesting, what he says, yes. The socialists recognize that the system is more productive, but they question it because they say it is unfair. The argument that Israel Kushner makes is okay. I share, if the system is unfair, it is not worth defending it. And that, for example, was one of the elements that inspired me to write my new book, which will be available soon, and called Moral as State Politics. That is to say, when one takes care to policies that are fair, that leads the results that are efficient, and that brings political returns and makes ideas become popular and wins elections and allows us to move forward. Uncle, if you want a good example, we are in 2025. We assume with a chainsaw, with the idea of endogenous dollarization, uncle. Things are in motion because we end the fiscal deficit, because we end the fiscal deficit, because we launch the endogenous dollarization, because we deepen it with fiscal innocence. In addition, we said that we were going to open the economy. We said that in terms of security, the one who does them pays them. And we said that in terms of international policy, we were going to open up and that we were going to become partners of excellence, especially with the United States and Israel. It seems to me that we have done everything. Thank you. Not only that, but as if that were not enough, we got to then midterm elections with 97% of our promises fulfilled, with about 15,000 regulations removed, And the promises we made during the campaign, that was for the entire period. That goes until 2027. We also fulfilled them before the first semester of the year, because we are to deficit zero. We got fiscal innocence. We got the European Union Mercosur agreement. We advanced the agreement with the United States. We advanced the EFTA. We advanced now the Trans-Pacific Agreement. Not only that, but also after, for 40 years, everyone tried a Labor Modernization Act. We not only tried it, but we also achieved it. Not only that, but we modified the glacial law, something that could not be done for more than 20 years. We lowered the age of imputability of minors, something that could not be done for 40 years. We just sent the projects to finish with the sinister project that has been the default. We remember that political caste defaulted and celebrate today. It's like you put yourself in front of your employees in a company, say that the company went bankrupt, and people celebrated it. I say, let's take this into account. Remember that they treated me as crazy every time with one of the proposals, and now people understand that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. They bought the idea in a deficit era. They bought the idea of deregulation. They bought the idea of freedom. Wow, we have done a lot of work in the fight for the idea of freedom. Especially because of the history of our country during the last century that has been marked by a statist mentality, and its consequences have been catastrophic. The central planning of the economy has not only been inefficient, but it was involved in all those errors that I proposed to remedy and deepen them. The measures and interventionists in charge of bureaucrats and supposed experts generated results diametrically against their original purpose. A clear example was the infamous rent law. His objective was supposedly that through the regulation of the market, more people could access a home, but to the surprise of no genuine liberal, the result was that the regulation decreased supplies deeply, and the tenants made is inaccessible, especially for those who can pay less for the price. That is, they ended up harming precisely those who wanted to benefit, who were the most vulnerable. Truth is that despicable being, I would almost say that he does not deserve to be mentioned, because he says that the problem is not the law, but that it was misapplied, and that in reality the problems of the application were because the Congress modified a sinister rent law. Well, we were successful, boss. That is why one of the first measures of our government was the rent law, and as a result, the offer rose again. As we all know, when the offer of a product rises to equal demand, prices tend to drop, and today we would say the property market flourishes. We seek to apply this simple principle of respect for property rights to all economic activities by removing the state from all those places that do not belong to it. That is, in dynamics, all of them. In other words, we are returning to society a power taken away by state coercion Logically, in the first place, we apply this principle in the sectors where the private sector has already proven to be efficient and successful, and we know these sectors because we have the advantage of having empirical evidence of all the history of humanity on our side, and we know that the freest countries are more prosperous, and is the main framework to accelerate this process. We think of something that we have called the insurance revolution. For us, this is an elegant way to advance in the organic reduction of the size of the state. In other words, let's see briefly what it is about. I think that freedom and security are two extremes of a spectrum within which human experience has moved. The greater security, less freedom, while to greater freedom, low levels of guarantees present, in a sense that the status quo is permanently subjected to the dynamics of the market. In the long term, however, to greater freedom present, greater future security is obtained because society will be more prosperous and will be able to better meet its needs. On the other hand, the choice of the current security and lack of freedom easily brings greater insecurity and less future freedom. A perfect example of this is the departure of the Jews from Egypt. He risked abandoning the certainty of captivity. They eventually arrived at the promised land, while those who stayed continued to be slaves all their lives in exchange for continuing to receive the free flesh. Hence the immortal phrase of Milton Friedman, "There is no such thing as a free lunch." In other words, in Egypt, the Jewish people had guaranteed food. The cost was freedom. If those who stayed in Egypt did not do well, only those who did dare to leave Egypt prospered. In other words, the desert was a choice of uncertainty, but faith led to true security and the freedom of that people. In effect, part of the success of the state in its expansion over the private sector had to do with its ability to impose itself as a last resort, that is, as a security network that contains individuals in the face of tomorrow's uncertainty. One of the things that I like to work on when I look at this topic is the idea of the state as a kind of insurance provider. So, what inspired me was a debate between Rawls, Nozick, and Hayek, where basically I have a lot of criticism about the Rawls case, but there is something that I find interesting, that if you have individuals who are at rest in the face of two scenarios where you can do very well in one and very badly in the other, if the individuals are at rest, what they are going to do, they are going to choose an intermediate solution. For you to have that intermediate solution, basically, what you need is an insurance market. And then what the state does is offer that insurance. In fact, notice that the great strategy that the left has in its different versions is the fear campaign. That is, the left always offers security, and that it is going to give this, and that it is going to get this, and that it is going to get the other, and in reality, it is always a fraud. It never fulfills anything. Instead, we propose freedom. And there is also something that is very interesting. This, or David's father, in the second edition of his book, The Theory of Prices, where he makes a series of contributions. One of the contributions he makes is in terms of distribution of income, for example. So he says there are two types of agents. There are agents who are more conservative, who are afraid, and there are agents who are more risky. So what happens? The agents who are more fearful, are more at risk, end up generating projects that have very low profitability, and therefore in those societies, oh, what are you doing, Ramira? I haven't seen you. So those societies are pariah, and those who are more risk takers, entrepreneurs, and who play them, or Christ, as it constitutes a club that can do well and can do badly. They make sure of each other. Our returns tend to the probabilistic limit, and everything is much better. That is the freedom. That also implies taking more risk. When you develop the insurance markets, what is going to happen is that you are going to capture the probabilistic limit. Therefore, you are going to be more prosperous. That is why it is so important to instill fear in society. And what did Casaresmo do during the dirty campaign in 1923? To instill fear in people. I mean, in that case, someone could go to the organ market to buy organs, or someone sold the kids, buying weapons and killing other kids in schools. I mean, well, they said that we were going to close public universities, and we just gave an increase of 28%, which the media did not inform either. Also that we were going to close hospitals. As far as I know, Morio did not close any, and they talked about the Garrahan. And it happens that today the Garrahan is in a situation that has never been in its history. That is, the left, in its different versions, operates trying to sow terror. If we manage to properly disseminate the idea of freedom and its results, in line with what David proposes, what is going to happen is that we are going to defeat them 1, 2 in 1,000 times in the elections. And as Federico Doming says, to be able to enter the liberal century, which brings us back to that situation, which retains us the gold that we used to have that bridge again, and make Argentina great again. Therefore, in this context of individuals at risk, state appears then offering insurance. So if people are afraid, for example, as not having health, they offer a health system. In fact, look at what the health system in Argentina has been. They charged us a large fee for giving us that insurance, and yet many of the people had to pay and were in the private sector. In fact, there's a wonderful book by Professor Alberto Venega Lynch and Professor Croes in defense of the most in need, which basically shares the case of health in Argentina, which originally was the best in the world, and 97% was private. But apart from that, I recommend that whole book so that you can see the lies of the statists. The people began to solve the problem in parallel. In other words, we paid twice the health issues. However, when the sinister came, called the pandemic, or if we had done things like a mediocre country, there had been 30,000 dead. However, there were 130,000. That is to say that one, they lived discharging a fee, they lived scaring people, and when the sinister appeared, they failed. But not only that, but also as they failed in the solution, they advanced over the private sector. Therefore, those who had paid twice for the same service also paid now in terms of quality to deterioration for all the disaster that politics had done in the public system, and with a catastrophic result in terms of human lives. Naturally, they also came to provide us the insurance of a currency, where in 1935 appeared the central bank, which was born from a scam. That's why we have to explain to people that the central bank was born from a scam, became, and it was an affairs institution created during an affairs period that was a conservative government. Because the central bank was invented in 1935, basically, you had to, as a result of the Great Depression, the exchange terms had fallen. There was a very powerful sector in Argentina that was indebted and gold. So what did they do? They created the central bank, generated an artificial devaluation, and not only that, but with the artificial devaluation, they generated a result in the central bank, and with that money, they lent money to those who were broke, and they rescued them. The consequence is that Argentina, having an average inflation rate prior to that of 0.9% per annum, jumped to 6% per annum. What did that imply? That after 10 years of doing that, basically the salaries of the workers were reduced to half in real terms. As if that were not enough, the workers he consumed feed. They also had to put the National Board of Grants. What was it created for? To put a sustainable price, so that there is a price above the balance. That is to say that the workers were made double Nelson, to be clear, and they're all institutions of authorities. Obviously, after 1945, things happened, and they were used in the opposite direction, and a lot of disasters were done. But let's be clear about how things are. That said, for example, the organic letter of the central bank, the original, not what it is now, that we should think how to change it. No, well, because the Brito market upon to an instrument of economic policy, assign 5 objectives. It's like, it doesn't give the math, but well, nothing. What can we expect from someone from a central bank who is a healer? It is almost that if one reads the current organic letter, for any reason he can emit money. That's how we were. They didn't let us spend a hyper. But what I mean is that Article 3 of the organic letter of the central bank said that it was the fundamental mission for the central bank of the Argentine Republic to defend the value of the currency. It seems to me that it didn't work, because we took 3 zeros from the currency. We could take 3 more. That said, inflation is an unregulated tax. Milton Friedman said it. So, see how the state started to violate. First, who signed the contract to say that they want a state, which is a definition. But let's suppose that we fail as a society to live in peace. Yes, then, as we fail, then we have a state, so that we don't kill ourselves. But I say, what is this institution? The central bank. It was born of a scam, and it continued to scam us for 90 years. Not only that, but it didn't reach the politicians with that. For example, in 1989, they made a Bonex plan. Yes, it was 1989, right? If I'm not mistaken, yes. But at the time, a loss of capital for the depositors of 90%. It didn't reach them with that. because later they stole us with the Corralito, Corlan, Alcatraz. We also didn't reach them with that. And then, in the late 90s, when we were younger, that we are older, the banner said that they were convertible by legal course. It means that they were backed by dollars. Well, they took out that loan and they seized the resale of a central bank, which at that time was a huge number. Did they stay in that? No, they didn't stay in that. What do you do? What do you say for when you are older? The retirement. Well, they went and the retirement was stalled. They stabilized the retirement system. That said, when we came to power, the Fund of Sustainability Guarantee had a value of $25.0 million, thanks to the liberals. Today, the Fund of Sustainability Guarantee of the retirees is $80.0 million. But they didn't stay in that expropriation. If you remember, let's say the default came as well. Obviously, the retirement was stalled. Not only that, but also then came the Macri blank. I remember that a man who has been complaining about the government all the time, he swore to me that he was going to do everything to destroy me. Said that the Macri blank was wonderful. Be careful, because this is Argentina. And what happened with the blank? Then came the Kirchner smell, and the blanks I hated, he sold them all. But not only that, Macri also has the record that defaulted the debt in pesos. Small detail. They called it refiling. It's called default. So what I mean is that the state has a huge history of being constantly violating the principle of an aggression. Not for nothing, the Argentines have in their pockets $400 billion. That is to say, that each of the insurance that the state offers us are actually all mechanisms by which the criminals, the politicians, steal from us. Therefore, as one, embrace the insurance market, something that with Federico we call the insurance revolution. One of the things that is going to happen is that we are going to be able to remove functions from the state. Why? Because the insurance is going to be there. And when the insurance is there, what is the point? I need less state. And if I need less state, I need less taxes. And if I have less taxes, I'm going to grow more. It's another way to accelerate economic growth. Look at all the debt that I'm throwing at you to explain what labor you're going to have, Adrian. So, in that, let's say, we are different from communism and other forms of utopism. We are not obsessed with creating any kind of Niemann or revealing ourselves against the natural order. That is why we do not deny the need of people for a minimum of security. What we propose is that the security network today, provided by the state, which is inefficient because it is the result of political management, is gradually moving, and as the insurance market allows it, it is moving towards the private sector, perhaps not in its entirety, let's say, but the technology will determine it. Because, after all, I am a monarchist in practice, but starting from the axiom that everything the state does can be done better by the market, we will do our best to allow the development of insurance markets for different sectors that guarantee those services in a mass effective and economic way. That is why theoretical efforts such as, because they extend the border as far as possible and allow us as a government to ask ourselves if that works. This opens up the possibility of looking for new solutions to all problems to which in Argentina for decades they were given wrong answers and in which the state always had a monopoly. So some could argue that it would be impossible, but we have heard the argument on the first day of our management for everything we did, and we demonstrated with great effort that it was possible. In fact, there is one of Federico's brilliant conferences. Today was too late for me, Federico. You off. Today it was your turn. One of the things Federico says is that they began to call on the subject of adjustment. So they said, well, how much do you have to adjust? 5 points. He says, well, how can we? No, I don't know, like a lot. 1 point per year. And then Federico says, well, we justify in a year, but now told me in a year. We made that adjustment in a month. That's why we continue to have, after 20. How many months have we had of government? 28, 29. I don't know. Well, during 29, we have a fiscal balance. I mean, we have dedicated ourselves to make possible what politics said was impossible. And also, thanks to David's work, we also know that a system like this would be beneficial in terms of political benefits. And if there are so many issues we manage to make the impossible possible, at least it would be interesting to turn it into a debate, so that at some point before discarding it by inertia or by a pre-established concept, let's encourage ourselves to discuss these things. But just as I recognize that enormous inspiration that David Friedman generated in me personally and in the policies that we are taking forward, I consider that I must be honest intellectually and continue to enrich the debate, which is nothing other than deepening the process of discovery of the hate, right? And like David, who dedicated himself to developing the argument in terms of efficiency, today I believe that the emphasis must be placed on the moral values of capitalism in order to fight the cultural battle, and for that the foundational ideas at John Locke are central. Around natural law, in conjunction with the Christian Jewish values, the highest ethics of Stoicism and Roman law at that point, which is what we define as the moral, as the state policy, we have 4 pillars. The first one has to do with during, let's say, what is fair. It has to do with ethical and moral. It has to do with what is fair. We do not believe in moral relativism. We understand that morality in different places can be different, but there are values that are not negotiable. That is why I like of our values are the Jewish Christian values. In fact, we lean on and base ourselves on the 10 Commandments in the Jewish version, the version that is in the book of Deuteronomy, which is in the Hashitru, where, for example, freedom is consecrated in the first commandment because it is written in a different way than the version L, more popularized. And the Hebrew version, the first commandment says, I am your God who took you out and freed you from the slavery of Egypt. It is a consecration of freedom. The sixth commandment says, not to kill. That is to respect life. That is a 7. says not to raise false testimony, let's say that is worse than stealing because it is the one that follows. In that sense, freedom once again takes relevance to the definition of liberalism of Professor Abolso Galinci. Son of liberalism, it is the respect and restriction of the project at the next life based on principle of non-aggression. That is, with these things, they not fuck, and in defense of the right to life, the freedom and to property. That is what will return us to prosperity. And not only that. That's a thing that about what we base ourselves is Greek philosophy, the Roman law, especially in Appiana, in terms of analysis of efficiency. Obviously, there is the issue of wall efficiency in static terms, with which we have discrepancies with neoclassical interpretation. In fact, that is why I like so much the demonstration of efficiency of Hans Hermann Hoppe, because basically it derives the optimality without having to resort to the topological structures that the neoclassical economy uses, which makes that when the reality is not mapped with that topological structure, the market failure, it is like God is quite arrogant, because the model is perfect, and if reality does not coincide, the problem is reality, not the model. That is something that I do not recommend for decision-making, because imagine now, I always imagine myself when I worked in the private sector. Well, now I work for the private sector, in some way, taking the vote from the state. But I imagine myself if I had gone and carried no well, but the model is like the model, and reality no well. If it is not mapped, reality is wrong, and I am going to torture reality so that it looks like the model. That is a shot. If you choose the henna company, you are going to lose a lot of money. The henna company does not happen. You know why? Because the most sensitive organ is going to crack. That is the pocket. So I say you will not have much time to do that thing. It is more word of socialism. Survivors 90, that is now when you want to take that thing to real life. It has been paid with misery and with human lives. However, let's say, I say this is interesting because one wants to face then. Socialism, one of the things it does is take morality as a cornerstone from which the entire political debate is drawn. They seem themselves altruistic. They seem themselves superior morally. So if we do not give them the discussion in terms of whether the system is fair or not, we will continue to lose as we have been losing during the last 100 years before we reach power. That is, if socialism debated from efficiency and would least the debate in seconds, given that its results were in sight of everything during the last century with millions of deaths of hunger, of cold, or at the tick of a rifle. That is, 150 million human beings were killed. That is why they must appeal to morality to justify such atrocities under the cloak of a supposed superior coming good. I'm not going to leave, because I'm not going to leave all the evil degenerated is wrapped in altruistic rhetoric, and they argue that it is for a greater good. They say that theft is good if it is against the rich. They say that crime must be tolerated because it is not fair to punish a theoretical victim of society. And so with all the issues, we say it here with the doctrine of sovereignty, and that some stupid journalists defended it without realizing that they were defending it. I say it has happened to me. To have to debate that's in a television program. We say, but well, it is also difficult to deal with so many people with IQ deficit and enormous egos. And that is why we cannot give them the land of morality. We cannot leave in their hands something is precious for any functional society as a definition of good and evil, because they will lean on this cornerstone to sink everything else. An excessively pragmatic argument, on the other hand, leaves the door open to debates that continue to turn around the violation of property rights in the name of systems that are supposed to be superiors, even if they are not. And in this field, the work of Mary Newton Rothbard, of Israel Kircher and Jesus Huerta de Soto, who taught us that if capitalism produces better results, it is pure and exclusively for being morally superior. There is a work by Jesus Huerta de Soto that is extraordinary, which is the theory of dynamic efficiency. I suggest emphatically to read that work, and it is precisely thanks to some alignment between legislation and morality that economic growth is guaranteed to a population. When these two pillars do not coincide, poverty and stagnation are only attained. That is to say, that something is legal does not necessarily make it fair. When natural law coincides with positive law, you have laws that are fair, and the result is prosperity. When natural law does not coincide with positive law, the result is unfair laws, and that, sooner or later, will destroy the moral and values of society, and they will end up sinking. I mean, there is no better example than ours. So our differences with David's are not so theoretical as rhetorical and strategic. The demonstration of the possibility of anarcho-liberalism serves us to build its efficiency, to build the moral foundation of itself, and to think politically about the convergence of social and economic, and to think politically about convergence towards that pole. Thus our vision is set on the horizon, on a world in which human freedom flourishes in all corners of the globe, and why not beyond the limits of the earth as well, because thanks to geniuses like Elon Musk, we are thinking about colonizing Mars. So let's say we do not have enough with the terrestrial globe, let's go for more. Thus, our vision is set on, let's say it, I go back to the speech. This is our mission, because we love man with all our strengths, and we see in him the future universe of possibilities that can be explored, and we understand that the main enemy to fight is that cowardly possession of peace alone and matrice that sees in human freedom a danger to exterminate, an enemy today in charge of the tyranny of a debauched state, eager to step on the headset there to make use of their natural freedom. In Argentina, we know well enough the struggles that this ideology has caused, and we dedicate all our management to walk that path. We firmly believe that we are giving a good example in that sense. We have faced an addictive disarray of public accounts, demolishing inflation, and giving Argentines the freedom to plan their lives as they want. In the framework of respect for life, freedom and property, we have carried out more than 16,000 deregulations that allow individuals to undertake, grow and invest without having to ask permission from officials to breathe air, even worse, pay them coimas. We created the REGI, an incentive regime to large investments that motorize the modernization of our entire economy, thanks to giving a clear and predictable rules to the investors. And now we are on the way to achieve the SIPA REGI, which will give a framework similar to industries or non-existent in the country, preparing our country to satisfy the demands of a world that still does not exist, but that is approaching at full speed. In fact, we have at this moment in Congress to run 19 projects, and we have to smoke that journalists appear saying the government is immobilized. I mean, not only do we already accomplish everything that we promised at the beginning when we got to power, but we also already did that. At midterm elections, we fulfilled everything there by March, April, and now we are going for more, and they say the government is immobilized. I mean, let's say, I never saw something so aggressive in the eyes. But well, it seems that the lack of guidelines makes them bad. So what I want to tell you with this is that the path of freedom is not an illusion of intellectuals locked up in their coffin and a story for children. It is the path that Argentina is already transiting in, that we expect the rest of the world to also transiting, because the future requires cooperation and trade between all free men in the world to accelerate prosperity to which we can access as a species. This is the fight we are giving, a battle on all fronts, the cultural battle, a political battle, and the battle in management. And we will not stop until Argentina is the freest country in the world, the country in which citizens have the best level of life, the best level of income, and enjoy all the fruits of human freedom. For all this, I want to sincerely thank all those present, worth the speakers David Friedman, Alberto Venegas and Chicha Adrian, Rabia, Martin Kroos and Agustin Lage, as well as the listeners for giving us your time to attend to these ideas, because you will be the ones in charge of learning them and repeating them to those who have ears for them. You are our legacy, just as David is the legacy of his father Milton. All this is for you, just as all our management is about that, because we have a firm conviction that liberalism is an ideology for and for the future, because that is where the flame of freedom shines more strongly, and with this light it inspires us to expand this present. Many thanks to all of you. May God bless you. May the force of heaven be with us, and long life freedom. Long life freedom. Long life freedom. Long life freedom.